Hey everyone, it's Justin Adkins from Justin Note by Justin, and I'm so excited to be on the Missing Stamps YouTube channel today to be creating a rather magical card with you. I am going to be using the Ups and Downs stamp set, the EIEIO frame die set, and the baddie stamp set, all by Missing Stamps. We're going to be using the main baddie from the baddie stamp set for our card. So let's start out our card by stamping out the villain for the stamp set. I'm positioning it in my Misty, and I am going to be using alcohol markers to color this baddie up. I'm using some blackout detail ink. This is a Copic safe ink that I often use when coloring up my images to make sure that it's going to not interfere with the type of markers that I'm using. So after I get my ink applied to my stamp, I use my Misty door to go ahead and shut everything down, and then we can begin the process of coloring. I want to kind of handle the coloring in this video a little bit different and just talk to you about my process of coloring overall. Don't worry, I've got all of the Copic markers that I use for this card listed in the YouTube description down below for your reference. When I color, I like to do something that's called coloring twice. Copic markers, or really any alcohol marker, work best when you saturate the paper because it helps the ink blend nicer on the paper. So I like to start from my darkest color, generally my darkest color, and work towards my lighter colors and just sort of building up that color. Once I color everything once, I then repeat the process going from dark to light once again, and I use my markers once more. The reason for the coloring twice is that my paper is saturated pretty well from the first round of using the ink, so when I add the second round of colors with coloring with my alcohol markers, it ends up amplifying the saturation of the ink, and it also helps the ink blend really nicely since this isn't the first time these colors are hitting the paper. It's also really important when coloring to make sure that you're coloring with a smooth paper that works well with alcohol-based markers. Not every paper is going to work, so don't think that the copy paper that you have in your printer right now is going to do a great job when working with your alcohol markers. I know that we all work with different materials and different sort of budgets, but just do a little bit of research and find a paper that works best for you. I like to use Copic Express It paper for my coloring, and I know that there are other brands of paper out there as well that work really well when it comes to your alcohol ink markering. Let's also talk about how many colors that you should have in a blend. Honestly, the way that I judge how many colors I want in a blend is generally about how large of a space I need to be coloring up. For example, the robe of this image, I use 4 different neutral gray Copic markers to get everything nicely colored up. However, when I was coloring up the face of the baddie and his skin, I was only using 3 markers, and that's because I was working with a much smaller space. I find that with the size of the robes on this image and them taking up the predominant portion of it, that 4 colors is really going to help me get a super nice blend going on. If you are working with a teeny tiny space, like you may have seen when I colored up his eyes, I just did 2 little dots from the same red Copic marker. Or maybe you want to go ahead and blend it with 2 because it's a slightly larger spot. Use a little bit of practice and judgment to figure out what works best for you, but like I said, I do generally find that the larger the space, the more markers are going to help you get a really nice blend with that sort of coloring. One last thing I want to talk about with coloring is choosing a type of gray that's going to work best for your project. I chose a neutral gray for this image because I liked the coldness of the gray, where the toner grays and especially warm grays provide a warmth that I wasn't looking for. I also thought that cool grays had a little bit too much blue in it for what this character needed. Lastly, for the one, I do end up going with some lighter earth tone colors. I think of bone as sort of similar to like an eggshell color, and there's a very slight piece of beige to it that I think it's important to incorporate. With my image all colored up, I then can go ahead and use the coordinating die set to tack down the die for this image and then process it through my die cutting machine. I highly recommend investing in a low tack mint tape when working with die cuts, as they really help keep those dies in place as you're processing them through your machine. I hate to color up this image and then have my die move around and then accidentally cut off portions that I colored and have to start from scratch. I want to work with a little bit of ink blending, and we're going to do our background using the Ups and Downs stamp set now. I have taped down a piece of light gray cardstock into my Misty, and I'm placing the Ups and Downs scene stamp into place so that I can pick it up with my Misty door. Once I'm happy with the positioning, I do use some anti-static powder to go ahead and ensure that I don't have any residual embossing powder when I'm done with that heat embossing portion of this panel. Using VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink, I go ahead and stamp up my image so that I get a nice crisp impression onto my paper. When heat embossing, I really like using a good ink that doesn't dry quickly, and I find that VersaFine Clair does that really well. So after I'm happy with the impression, I take some clear embossing powder and I go and I sprinkle it on top of my panel. This is really important as to why using an ink that doesn't dry quickly is going to be best for you, because the ink is still a little bit wet and it's going to allow this clear embossing powder to cling really nicely to it. So once I get all the excess tapped off, I do grab my heat gun and I get everything set with the heat embossing. Now, this is of course sped up, so don't rush your heat gun. Go at a pace and just ensure that all of your little nooks and crannies are nicely set. Let's work with that ink blending for our background. So now I do have light gray paper, and I'm going to use some Hickory Smoke Distress ink with a larger ergonomic blending tool to blend the edges of my card and bring that Hickory Smoke ink into the center of our ups and downs background. I'm using this large ergonomic blending tool because it works really well for the amount of ink that I want to apply into the paper. I also think that by me heat embossing the background of the ups and downs, it sort of locks that ink into place, so I don't have to worry about accidentally ink blending what I've stamped already and possibly smudging part of my project. So I'm going in really gently to ink blend these edges. I'm trying to make sure to get almost what I would call an ombre or a nice transition of color, going from the light color of the cardstock that you'll find in the center of the card to the darker hickory smoke that you're going to find toward the edges. It's going to be darkest towards the edge because that is where I am beginning with my ink blending tool, so the most ink is getting applied directly to the edge where it's sort of dissipating as it gets brought into the center. I know this portion of the video is taking a little bit longer to watch, but I didn't want to fast forward with it because I think there are some really good tips to help amplify your ink blending skills. So I'm just going in and I'm going to finish up with the Hickory Smoke ink, and once I'm happy, I want to darken this even a little bit more, so I'm going to pull in some Black Soot Distress ink. I'm going to basically repeat what I just did with the Hickory Smoke and take that Black Soot Distress ink with the same ink blending tool. Hey, gray and black, I consider them part of the same color family, and I'm going to start from the outside, blending in towards the center of the card along the edges. I think it's really good to have those nice dark edges because it's really going to make this center scene panel of our card stand out a lot. And it's going to also act as a focal point for our main image because I plan on positioning him in the lightest portion of this background. So your eye's almost going to get drawn to him because it's going to be the lightest portion of the card. Now I'm going in with that Black Soot Distress ink just to make sure that it's a nice smooth transition, and once I'm entirely satisfied, we're going to grunge it up just a little bit. I do pull in the EIEIO frame die set using one of the non-stitched smaller rectangles to die cut out my scene. I don't die cut directly in the center. I pick which portion of this panel is going to work best for me, and I go and I die cut this panel off camera. Now to start the grunge process of this card, I'm going to place my background on a piece of scrap paper and use some Twisted Citron Distress Spritz. This works really nicely to add the perfect amount of shimmer to my background, and I just think that this Twisted Citron color complements our baddie so perfectly. I'm also going to pull in a couple paper splatters just to go and make this background a little bit more striking. I'm going to use an opaque white paper splatter, and you're going to see how it's going to be extremely noticeable really quick because it's going to contrast with the dark edges of the card. And then once we have everything into place with that, I also use almost a neon kiwi lime color to splatter on the background as well, just to bring a little bit more green to this panel because that Distress Spritz does kind of act as almost like a background shimmer. Here's a little bit of a closer look as to how much shimmer and shine you're going to get with this card using some Distress Spritz, and we're going to put that off to the side. Using the scalloped rectangle from EIEIO, I die cut a rectangle shape out, and I'm also going to use that same Distress Spritz once again just to add a little bit of shimmer and splatter to the edges of this scalloped rectangle. The splatter is going to add a really nice subtle detail that's going to definitely be noticeable when everything is put together. Now, getting our sentiment ready, I'm going to use some black cardstock and heat emboss the sentiment just a note from You Know Who. I think that this sentiment is just so dang cute and it's so perfect for this card. So we're going to use some anti-static powder onto our black cardstock. We're going to stamp our image out in a trusty watermark embossing pad. Now, I do like to recommend using a fresh watermark pad whenever possible because you definitely get a nice crisp impression. And then I use some white embossing powder to emboss our sentiment. So I like to pour it on top of the wet ink, tap off the excess, and then off camera, put the excess back into the jar. Using my heat gun, I do set my sentiment nicely in place, and then using my guillotine trimmer, I trim my sentiment down into a little sentiment rectangle. Making sure that my edges are nice and tight, I'm going to have this nice little sentiment that I'm going to be able to use later on in my project just to sort of tie everything together. We've got all of our elements ready, so I'm going to begin the process of adhering and assembling the entire card. So using our background, I'm going to adhere that directly on top of the green scalloped rectangle that we had die cut and spritzed earlier. Once I'm happy with how that is put into place, I'm going to put liquid adhesive on the back of the scalloped rectangle and adhere that to an A2 sized panel of black cardstock. Now, when I say A2, I mean 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. So once I get that nicely adhered, I can then begin the process of putting my elements on top of our background and sort of building out the scene. I love to use foam tape for my projects because my foam tape use really helps bring emphasis to different elements of my card that I think are important. So I am going to use some 3mm foam tape strips on the back of our main villain and sort of ensuring that every sort of important bit with him gets a little bit of support from that foam tape. Once I'm happy with the placement of where our villain goes on the card on the staircase, I'm then going to use the same foam strips to adhere to the back of our sentiment rectangle, and this way I can ensure that my villain and my sentiment rectangle are going to get the same sort of depth. With those nicely put into place, I do use liquid adhesive on the back of my card panel, and I'm going to adhere it to an A2 sized card base. When I'm happy with the positioning, I pull out some black and white enamel dots and I just add 3 black enamel dots to my project just to sort of tie in the different dark tones we've been using for our project. Once those are nicely into place, my card is fully completed. Thank you so very much for stopping by today for some villainous and sparkly inspiration. I hope this card provides you with some fun ideas for how you can use your favorite magic sets by missing stamps for your next creation. If you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe, and also follow me at Justin by Justin on all socials, of course including Instagram and YouTube. Thanks again for stopping by, and happy crafting, everyone. Goodbye.